At $1.5 billion a year of our hard-earned tax dollars, the CBC has so many options what to waste that on. Hockey Night in Canada television rights? Check. Olympic broadcast rights? Check. Hiring fake actors for an anti-Trump CBC marketplace investigation? Check. Blowing money on a lavish party for Strombo? Check. And heck, the CBC even advertises their own recently retired anchor, Peter Mansbridge, with our tax dollars in newspapers. And so, I guess it was after all that spending and millions of dollars more on other useless stuff that the CBC finally came up with their latest idea. A podcast. But not just any podcast. A podcast based on a futuristic post-apocalyptic British Columbia in 2050 after the ravages of climate change. Now, if you're thinking this must be the latest brilliant idea from Climate Barbie, well, you'd be wrong. I don't even believe for 1 second Climate Barbie would be this sadistic. Only the CBC. Officially titled 2050 Degrees of Change. And just look at this graphic they've created for it. The silhouette of Vancouver with a human forced to wear a mask because of all the pollution. Do they even know how clean the air is here in Vancouver? And if you think that graphic or the name is bad, take a listen to just how ridiculous and full of fear-mongering their first episode is. Here is CBC meteorologist and host of the podcast, Joanna Wagstaff.
We're used to it now. Extreme weather, making some pretty extreme headlines. Stories about this season's storms, floods, or fires being the worst or most dramatic in recent memory.
Today we're getting an estimate of the cost of the Fort McMurray wildfire.
It is the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history.
$3.6 billion in insured damages, more than 27...
As a meteorologist, every time a city floods or a forest burns, I get asked if it's connected to climate change. And for years, I've carefully explained that one storm isn't necessarily the result of climate change. But now, I'd like to change my answer to just yes. Because our warming climate is resulting in rapid and transformative change. Changes we're going to explore by exploring our future.
Did you catch that? You know, for years we've been told no individual weather event could be used as evidence for global warming or as evidence against global warming. But now, all of a sudden, this CBC meteorologist who can't accurately predict the weather 2 days from now wants to change her mind and say that flood last week in a remote part of northern BC, well, it was because of climate change, and specifically your decision to drive an SUV. Or that wildfire in rural Quebec? Yeah, that isn't natural at all. It's because of the fact you won't ride your bike to work. Well, let's cut the sanctimonious crap. Let's take a look at the facts for a second. You may have heard of the pause in global warming. Specifically, that is a noted 18-year pause in the rise of global temperatures between 1997 and 2014. For 18 carbon-intensive years, where humans and the Earth emitted more carbon into our atmosphere than ever before, the average global temperature remained the same. A stark contrast to the hundreds and hundreds of computer-generated models created by the world's leading climate scientists that never predicted any pause and thus greatly overestimated the amount of warming that was to come. Another fact for you. During this same period, global hurricane and typhoon activity is at a 45-year low. So, by the CBC's leading global warming and climate change expert Joanna Wagstaff's theory, that 45-year low in hurricane activity is actually because of climate change. You heard her say it, that every weather event is now directly related to climate change. So the lull in hurricane activity must be as well. And by that logic, climate change is good. But I won't stand here and pretend to be a climatologist, a meteorologist, or any other kind of scientist. So let's get back to the content of this crazy CBC podcast. Despite my pointed criticism and amusement that is what the CBC is using with our tax dollars to fund this podcast, you won't be surprised to hear that many adherers to the cult of climate change absolutely love what CBC and Joanna Wagstaff have done. The Tides and Rockefeller-funded DeSmog blog, of which climate change hysteria flows from like an open wound, could barely control their excitement when they had a Q&A sit-down with Wagstaff. Q&A with the host of CBC's badass new podcast about climate change. The article was titled. Badass? I'm sorry, but if I'm using the term badass to describe a podcast, it might be for a Joe Rogan episode or something on motorcycles or the military. But a climate change podcast being badass? That's a little bit of a reach, don't you think? Even for the CBC. The content of the interview is even more illuminating when Wagstaff explains why she wanted to do a podcast on what climate change will do to BC by 2050. There is very little science being discussed, just alarmism and hysteria. It's quite unbelievable, actually. Quote, "I've always been thinking about how to tell the story of climate change, especially as a meteorologist. I see every day how climate change has increased the number of severe weather events and big weather events that impact communities. In the past decade of forecasting, I've really seen how climate change has impacted my job as a meteorologist and how that has impacted more people around the world. I spent a lot of time thinking about how to tell the story of climate change, and it's not always the easiest story to pitch." Unquote. Look, I think I might know why. Facts are pesky things when they aren't on your side, and the fact is climate change projections, predictions, and models have all overestimated the amount of warming that has occurred the past 20 years or so. And yet they soldier on, as you heard, now willing to throw away their principles and simply say that every single weather event is related to climate change. What a joke. For the Rebel.media, I'm Christopher Wilson. You know, climate alarmism and climate hysteria is something the CBC just does the best. And make sure you never miss a video criticizing those. Click subscribe on all our Rebel Media channels.